everyone, welcome into another episode of 3 Up, 3 Down. I am Rob Wong. On this episode, we'll talk about a former Blue Jays prospect returning to the organization, what the Jays should do with the struggling Andres Gimenez, and another edition of Remember Me as we look back at a former Blue Jay you may or may not have forgotten. So I'm recording this one during Game 2 of the series between the Blue Jays and Braves at Truist Park. Almost called it Fulton County Stadium for a second there. Can't let go of the 1992 World Series. But we've got some news with regards to the Toronto Blue Jays, who of course have been looking to add some pitching depth. We know how taxed the bullpen has been. We know how taxed the rotation has been over the last little bit here. And the Blue Jays bringing in a familiar face. Arden Zwelling of Sportsnet, Mitch Bannon of The Athletic, both reporting that the Blue Jays have acquired Simeon Woods Richardson from the Minnesota Twins for cash considerations. Woods Richardson was DFA'd by the Twins on the weekend as he's been having a rough season, to say the least. A 7.74 ERA in 12 appearances, 10 of those starts. Hard to believe he's still just 25 years old, still a young pup as far as his professional baseball career goes, but Arden Zwelling adds that he is out of options, so he is going to be joining the Blue Jays Major League roster, and the role is still to be determined. And as I mentioned in the stats there, both started and relieved for the Twins this year. So an interesting gamble. I think it's definitely worth it. I know the numbers on the season are nothing to write home about with an ERA over 7. I'm sure a lot of you are looking at those numbers and hearing about those numbers and wondering, well, why would the Blue Jays want to take a guy who has not been able to get major league hitters out and throw him against major league hitters so far this year? But of course, the Blue Jays had him in the system before dealing him to Minnesota, so there's a lot of familiarity with him there. I think it's a situation where, one, the Blue Jays have seen him get outs at the major league level, and maybe they're not buying into what the results have been so far this year. And as we know, with Major League Baseball, pro baseball in the year 2026, ERA is not the way that teams evaluate pitchers and players anymore. There's a lot of different ways that teams look at guys and what they think they can provide to their organization. And, Woods Richardson, as I mentioned, last year pitched to a 4.04 ERA, but the expected ERA was a shade under 4 at 3.79. The year before, the expected ERA was sitting around 4 as well, and had the results in a similar fashion as far as the earned run average. So here's a guy that has had the ability to get major league hitters out. Doesn't throw particularly hard compared to other major leaguers these days, but still averaging around 93 with the fastball. He has some pretty decent off-speed offerings as well. This year really picked up the splitter and used it a lot more, 26% on the splitter usage for the Twins this year. And as we know, the Blue Jays are obsessed with splitters. You don't have to go too far to find a Blue Jays pitcher that throws one, especially a starting pitcher. Of course, with Kevin Gausman and Trey Yesavage, the Blue Jays have an affinity for that pitch, and a big reason why is because it is split neutral, and essentially it means it fares the same against both left-handed hitters and right-handed hitters. If you think of a pitch as an example like a slider, that tends to work better against opposite-handed hitters because it's moving away from them, but splitters generally go straight down, and that works against both handedness. So, an interesting aspect there that maybe they see something in his repertoire that they think they can tweak and they think they can work with, and maybe he does become an interesting option here because, as I said, just 25 years old, so still pliable to a certain extent. He's got some ability. Is out of options, though, so if the Blue Jays do decide, hey, after 2 weeks or so it's not working out, then they're going to have to expose him again and designate him for assignment. But the move as well for the roster spot. Joe Mantiply goes to the 60-day IL to create room on the 40-man roster for Woods Richardson. And Zwelling adds that Mantiply is undergoing arthroscopic surgery on his left knee. which is unfortunate because Joe Mantiply, who at the beginning of the year, not sure how many people thought he would be a factor, ended up being a pretty good factor for this Blue Jays bullpen. Pitched to an ERA of 2.04 in 17 and 2/3 innings. Crazy that he appeared in 17 games for the Blue Jays this year, but looked a lot like the guy that was really successful as a member of the Arizona Diamondbacks about 4 years ago and was able to hold down the fort as far as that second left-handed spot out of the bullpen. So thanks, Joe Mantiply, for the memories. We appreciate you coming out and helping out the Blue Jays this year. But tough break for him, undergoing arthroscopic knee surgery, so we'll see how long he is going to be out. But Woods Richardson, now back with the Blue Jays, is an intriguing option, and we'll see how he gets used here by John Schneider. As I mentioned, the Blue Jays needing help not only in the rotation at the back end, of course, with some of the injuries they're dealing with, but in the bullpen too, because we know how taxed some of their relievers have been so far in 2026. So we go from a guy who has struggled as far as pitching this year to a guy that has been really struggling on the offensive side of things, and that is Andres Gimenez of the Toronto Blue Jays. And look, we get it. With Gimenez, you're not really concerned about the offense. He is strictly a defensive first player. That's why the Blue Jays acquired him, and he has done that in spades this year, has been one of the better shortstops defensively in all of Major League Baseball this year with 5 outs above average. But I think there was probably some hope and some optimism that when the Blue Jays brought him over from Cleveland, they would be able to unlock something offensively with Gimenez, and that just hasn't been the case. It's been in decline for him really the last 4 years. You go back to 2022, where he had that career year, put up a 141 WRC plus as a member of the Cleveland Guardians, and putting up 6 F-WAR that year. He was fantastic. But since then, the WRC plus dropped to 96 in 2023, dropped to 83 in 2024, and then of course they cut ties with him and sent him to the Blue Jays, where last year he had a 70 WRC plus. Did have some big hits, come playoff time. We remember those home runs that he hit against the Seattle Mariners. It does seem, for whatever reason, he performs well in high leverage situations and comes up with clutch hits, but outside of that is not able to hit consistently. And then this year, got off to a really good start in April, but the WRC plus now on the season is down to 68. And over the last couple of weeks, the WRC plus is running at 14 for Andres Gimenez. He has not had a good stretch here in May and early June. He, coming into the game on Wednesday, was 4 for his last 39. Did have a home run, but really hasn't been able to provide much offense. And the reason I bring it up, because in game 1 of that series against the Braves, the Blue Jays had a spot there late in the ball game where they let Gimenez hit with runners on base. He was not able to bring anyone in and drive in any runs. And then it was Jesus Sanchez pinch hitting for Brandon Valenzuela, who was on deck. And I know Valenzuela has cooled off quite a bit here after a really strong run for a couple of weeks, but I just thought it was interesting because Gimenez himself has not had a great year and is also not going well. And in that situation, there was only 1 out, and I would have thought, okay, this is the time to pinch hit with Jesus Sanchez. And then with Valenzuela, you let him hit because at the very least, he can draw a walk. He's not an automatic out. He has shown the ability to get on base at a decent clip. And I just found it interesting that that was the decision the Blue Jays chose. And maybe it's a case where manager John Schneider is playing the vet, and he's deciding to go with the guy who is his everyday shortstop. But right now, when you're the Blue Jays and you're trying to win ball games and get back into this playoff race, I think you have to take the positive margins where you can get them. And I think having Jesus Sanchez hit in that spot over Andres Gimenez was probably more worth it. Maybe you're worried that, if Jesus Sanchez drives in a run and the game's tied, then what do you do at shortstop? Well, you've got Ernie Clement that can play shortstop, and then you try to figure it out. Charles McAdoo comes in and plays second. You've got some options there. But all that being said, I just wonder if it gets to a point here where if Andres Gimenez continues to struggle offensively and he comes up with in spots where it's high leverage, do the Blue Jays consider pinch hitting for him in that spot if it's a right-handed pitcher on the hill? Because historically, since Gimenez has been a Blue Jay, they generally don't pinch hit for him when there's a right-hander on the mound. They only pinch hit for him if there's a lefty on the mound and they go to a righty. But could be an option for John Schneider at this point if things continue to go south for Andres Gimenez. All right, time to wrap things up with another edition of Remember Me, where we look back at a former Blue Jay you may or may not have forgotten. And this episode's former Blue Jay, Brandon League, who you may remember was a reliever for the Blue Jays from 2004 to 2009. He was a second-round pick by the Blue Jays out of a high school in Honolulu, Hawaii back in 2001, and famously was a part of the Brandon for Brandon trade in the offseason of 2009, where League and prospect Yohermin Chavez went to the Seattle Mariners for Brandon Morrow, who ended up being a Blue Jay and personally was one of my favorite Blue Jays from back in those days. I know everybody remembers, of course, the incredible 18 strikeout game against the Tampa Bay Rays that he had, where he almost had the no-hitter against them. Was a phenomenal day at the ballpark. I remember watching that on TV. Watching that game where he had against the Rays, and look, it was a hit. The one against Morrow where Aaron Hill dove, and I know people wanted it to be an error to preserve the no-hitter for Brandon Morrow, but no, it definitely was a base hit. And sorry, my mistake, 17 strikeouts in that game, not 18, but one of the greatest performances in Blue Jays history as far as pitching performances go. But when it comes to Brandon League, I just remember back in those days thinking, wow, this is crazy to watch a guy that can actually hit triple digits on the gun. Had sort of the cool look with the sports sunglasses through three quarters, almost kind of sidearm, had a crazy motion. He was a lot of fun to watch. I know he only had really one, maybe two good seasons with the Blue Jays. Yeah, now that I look at it, he had a really good year in 2006 where he had a 2.53 ERA in 33 appearances. Then in 2008, he pitched in 31 games, had a 2.18 ERA out of the pen for the Blue Jays. Ultimately became an all-star for the Seattle Mariners in 2011, saved 37 games for them. He went on to pitch for the Dodgers before going out of baseball, pro baseball, as far as the major league level goes, in 2015 after his final year in 14 with the Dodgers. But always enjoyed watching Brandon League pitch. Just something about the look, something about a guy throwing 100 miles an hour was really cool back in those days where there weren't a ton of pitchers being able to hit triple digits on the gun. And if you're a Brandon Morrow fan like me, it ended up working out. If the Blue Jays don't draft and develop Brandon League, they don't get Brandon Morrow, who provided a ton of value for the Blue Jays over his 5 seasons with Toronto. I know it was up and down at times and maybe never lived up to his full potential, but provided some awesome years as a member of the Blue Jays did Brandon Morrow. So there you have it, another edition of Remember Me. You can send your ideas on who you want to hear next. Just hit me up on Twitter at RobWong34 or at the podcast account at 3_up_3_DWN. Lastly, wanted to wrap up this podcast by giving a shout out to Craig and Jason over at the Jaybird Watching Podcast for having me on Wednesday evening on their live stream to talk all things Blue Jays. Make sure to go check them out on Twitter at BirdWatchingGC. That'll do it for another episode of 3 Up, 3 Down. Make sure to follow, share the pod on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Drop a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and let me know your biggest takeaway from today's episode. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Rob Wong. You've been listening to 3 Up, 3 Down. We'll talk to you again on Monday.